April 1945, the Ruhr Valley. A German mother clutches her two children as artillery shells thunder in the distance. Her city is rubble. Food ran out days ago. The water supply stopped working weeks ago. Disease is spreading. And now, American forces are closing in. She expects the worst. Years of propaganda have told her what to expect from the enemy. Revenge, brutality, the same treatment German forces inflicted across Europe. She huddles in a basement shelter, waiting for whatever comes next. Then she hears voices, English, American accents, boots on the stairs, the moment she's been dreading. But what happens next will leave her stunned. The American soldiers don't come with weapons raised. They come with rations, medical supplies, instructions to the nearest aid station. One young soldier, barely 20 years old, offers her children chocolate from his own pack. This is the story German civilians couldn't believe. The story of American troops who, after fighting across Europe against Nazi Germany, risked their own lives to save the very people they'd been fighting against. A story of humanity persisting through hatred, of compassion, surviving the brutality of total war. The context begins years before those American soldiers arrived in German cities. It begins with understanding what America knew about Nazi Germany and what ordinary Germans had become complicit in through action or silence. By 1945, American forces had been fighting in Europe for nearly 3 years. They'd landed in North Africa in November 1942, invaded Sicily in July 1943, hit the beaches at Normandy on June 6, 1944. Every mile gained came at tremendous cost. American casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands, and with every mile into Germany, American soldiers discovered the full horror of Nazi crimes, the concentration camps, the mass graves, the industrial machinery of genocide. At Dachau, at Buchenwald, at dozens of camps across Germany, American troops found the evidence of systematic mass murder. Emaciated survivors barely clinging to life, piles of corpses, gas chambers and crematoriums. The psychological impact on American soldiers was profound. These weren't abstract crimes read about in newspapers. These were atrocities witnessed firsthand, the stench of death, the hollow eyes of survivors. The meticulous German record-keeping documenting every murder. Many American soldiers felt rage, justifiable rage at what had been done. Some lost their composure when confronting SS guards. At Dachau, American soldiers and liberated prisoners engaged in acts of immediate retribution against captured SS personnel. These weren't official actions. They were the spontaneous reactions of men confronted with industrial-scale murder. Given this context, what happened next becomes even more remarkable, because despite everything American forces had witnessed, despite the justified anger and horror, official American policy and the actions of countless individual soldiers demonstrated a commitment to humanitarian principles that transcended the desire for revenge. The challenge facing American forces in Germany by spring 1945 was unprecedented. Millions of German civilians were displaced. Cities lay in ruins from years of Allied bombing campaigns. The Nazi government had collapsed, leaving no functioning civil authority. Food supplies had broken down. Medical care had ceased. Disease was spreading, and caught in this chaos were German civilians, women, children, elderly men. Many had supported the Nazi regime. Many had benefited from Nazi policies. Some had actively participated in atrocities. But many were also ordinary people who'd been swept along by events beyond their control or comprehension, and now they faced starvation, disease, and death. American military planners had anticipated this humanitarian crisis. The challenge was how to respond. International law required occupying powers to prevent starvation and epidemic disease among conquered populations. But American public opinion was divided. Why should American resources go to feed Germans after everything Germany had done? The initial occupation directive, known as JCS 1067, reflected this tension. It ordered American forces to prevent disease and unrest that might endanger occupation troops. But it explicitly prohibited any action designed to rehabilitate or strengthen the German economy. The message was clear. Keep Germans alive enough to prevent chaos, but don't help them prosper. President Franklin Roosevelt's personal views reflected broader American anger. When asked about German civilians potentially facing starvation, Roosevelt reportedly responded with harsh words, suggesting soup kitchens and questioning why Germans shouldn't experience hunger after what they'd inflicted on others. But on the ground in Germany, American soldiers and commanders faced stark realities that transcended policy debates. They saw children starving. They encountered elderly civilians dying from preventable diseases. They witnessed desperation that whatever Germans had done or supported was still human suffering happening in front of them. General Lucius Clay, deputy military governor of the American occupation zone, became increasingly concerned by summer 1945. He recognized that hungry, desperate people make poor candidates for democratic reform. His oft-quoted warning captured the dilemma. There is no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. The practical challenges were immense. German agricultural production had collapsed. Farm equipment was destroyed or worn out. Fertilizer was unavailable. Labor was scarce. The particularly harsh winter of 1946 to 1947 would make everything worse. Urban Germans were receiving between 1,000 and 1,500 calories per day. Starvation levels. American military personnel faced strict regulations. They were ordered not to share their rations with German civilians. Military wives who arrived later in the occupation received explicit instructions not to allow German domestic workers access to food scraps. Leftovers were to be destroyed rather than given to starving Germans. Yet many American soldiers and their families chose to ignore these orders. They saw hungry children. They encountered desperate mothers. And they made individual decisions that their conscience demanded, regardless of official policy. Food was shared, rations were given away. The regulations, harsh as they were, couldn't suppress basic human compassion. The airlift of food supplies initially went to displaced persons and liberated prisoners, not to German civilians. Throughout 1945, international aid organizations like the Red Cross were prohibited from assisting ethnic Germans. The policy was deliberate. Germans would face the consequences of their nation's actions, but as the humanitarian crisis deepened, reality forced policy changes. By early 1946, President Harry Truman reversed course. He authorized limited food shipments to German civilians. He publicly endorsed Kralog, the Council of Relief Agencies licensed to operate in Germany, which could now solicit donations for German relief. The first care packages began arriving in Germany in 1946. Americans, despite everything, purchased relief packages for German families. The packages contained food items that were luxuries in post-war Germany: coffee, chocolate, canned goods, but more than physical sustenance, they represented something else: reconciliation, moving forward. The recognition that German children bore no responsibility for Nazi crimes. The contrast between official policy and individual action revealed itself most clearly at the local level. American soldiers tasked with occupation duties had to work with German civilians to restore basic services: water systems, power plants, food distribution. This required daily interaction, cooperation, even trust. The non-fraternization policy, established in March 1945, forbade American soldiers from walking with Germans, shaking hands, visiting their homes, or giving or receiving gifts. Field Marshal Montgomery's directive to British forces was equally strict. You must not fraternize with Germans at all. The policy proved impossible to enforce. American soldiers working alongside German civilians to rebuild infrastructure couldn't avoid basic human interaction. Some soldiers actively sought relationships with German women. Others simply felt compassion for people in desperate circumstances. By June 1945, the ban on fraternizing with German children was lifted. By July, soldiers could hold conversations with adult Germans in public. But beyond policy changes, extraordinary acts of individual courage demonstrated how some American soldiers put humanitarian principles above everything else. These weren't publicized widely. They weren't part of official military operations. They were moments when individuals faced impossible choices and chose humanity. Consider the efforts to protect German civilians caught in combat zones. As American and Soviet forces converged on German territory, German civilians found themselves trapped between opposing armies. The Soviet treatment of German civilians was harsh, reflecting the brutal nature of the Eastern Front War. Soviet soldiers had witnessed German atrocities in Russia. They'd seen their cities destroyed, their people murdered. When they reached German territory, restraint was not their priority. American soldiers sometimes found themselves in the position of protecting German civilians from Soviet forces. This created impossible situations. The Soviets were allies, but Soviet treatment of German civilians violated American soldiers' sense of justice and humanity. Some American units positioned themselves to provide informal protection, knowing it could create diplomatic tensions. The liberation of concentration camps created another complex situation. When American forces opened camp gates, they found not only the intended victims, but also, in the surrounding areas, German civilians who claimed ignorance of what had happened. American soldiers, fresh from witnessing the camp's horrors, struggled with this claimed ignorance. In some cases, American commanders forced German civilians from nearby towns to tour the camps, to see the evidence, to confront what had been done in their name. This wasn't revenge, though it must have felt like punishment to the Germans involved. It was an attempt to ensure that the truth couldn't be denied. Yet even in those moments, American medical personnel provided aid to Germans who collapsed or became ill during these forced confrontations. The commitment to basic medical care extended even to those who bore moral responsibility through passive complicity. The treatment of German prisoners of war revealed similar tensions. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers surrendered to American forces in the final months of the war. The Ruhr pocket alone yielded over 300,000 prisoners. Providing for these men, plus hundreds of thousands more captured elsewhere, created enormous logistical challenges. The Rheinwiesenlager, temporary prison camps along the Rhine, became scenes of significant hardship. Open-air enclosures with minimal shelter or sanitation. Food supplies stretched impossibly thin across massive prisoner populations. Conditions in these camps, particularly in the first months, were harsh. Estimates of deaths in these camps vary, but even conservative numbers run into thousands. Yet, compared to German treatment of Soviet prisoners, where 60% perished, or Soviet treatment of German prisoners, the American approach was restrained. German prisoners in American custody had a survival rate of over 99%. This wasn't because conditions were good. They weren't. It was because American forces, despite being overwhelmed by numbers and angry about what they'd discovered in Germany, maintained basic standards. The gradual improvement of conditions in the prison camps reflected both practical capacity improvements and deliberate policy choices. By February 1946, the Red Cross gained access to American prison camps and could provide limited relief. The restrictions eased as the immediate post-surrender chaos resolved into more organized occupation. These early decisions, made under extraordinary pressure, would shape post-war Germany in ways few imagined at the time. The choice to prevent mass starvation, despite justified anger, meant that German society survived intact enough to eventually rebuild. The decision to maintain basic humanitarian standards, even when facing logistical nightmares and public opposition, created the foundation for future reconciliation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of American behavior in occupied Germany was what happened at the individual level. The young soldiers who shared their chocolate with starving German children. The medics who treated German civilians alongside liberated prisoners. The officers who quietly bent regulations to prevent unnecessary suffering. These weren't heroic acts in the traditional military sense. There were no medals for feeding hungry children or ensuring German hospitals had medicine. These were small moments of humanity that multiplied across thousands of soldiers over months and years, changed the trajectory of post-war Europe. German civilians who experienced this firsthand struggled to reconcile what they witnessed with what they'd been told about Americans. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as cultural barbarians and ruthless enemies. The reality of American soldiers treating them with basic human decency, even after discovering concentration camps, challenged every assumption. One German woman recalled, decades later, her shock when American soldiers helped her find medical care for her sick child instead of ignoring her pleas, or worse. She'd expected brutality. She'd prepared for the worst. What she experienced was young Americans who saw a sick child and responded as humans rather than as vengeful conquerors. These individual moments, forgotten in the broader sweep of history, represented something profound. They represented the persistence of humanitarian values even in the face of discovered atrocities. They showed that individuals could choose compassion over revenge, even when revenge would have been justified and understandable. But some moments transcended even these quiet acts of individual compassion. Some moments demanded courage that went beyond sharing rations or bending regulations. Moments when American soldiers literally put their lives on the line, not to defeat German forces, but to protect German civilians and prisoners from other threats. May 5th, 1945. Castle Itter in the Austrian Alps, just days before the war's official end. Inside the medieval fortress, 14 French prisoners awaited their fate. Former prime ministers, generals, politicians, tennis star Jean Borotra, men the Nazis had held as valuable hostages throughout the war. Their German guards had fled, but freedom brought its own dangers. Nearby, fanatical Waffen-SS troops, refusing to accept Germany's collapse, planned to storm the castle and execute everyone inside. These weren't regular Wehrmacht soldiers ready to surrender. These were true believers, willing to fight to the death even after Hitler's suicide. The prisoners sent a cook named Andreas Krobot to find help. He reached the town of Wörgl, where he encountered something remarkable. German Major Joseph Gangl, who defied orders to retreat, now protected Austrian civilians from SS reprisals. Gangl had maybe 20 men, not enough to defend the castle against over 100 SS troops. So Gangl did something extraordinary. He grabbed a white flag and drove toward American lines to surrender and ask for help. Not help for himself. Help for French prisoners and Austrian civilians threatened by his own side. He found Captain Jack Lee of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, a rough-talking American tanker who didn't hesitate when he heard the situation. Lee organized a rescue mission immediately. He gathered 14 American soldiers, requisitioned Sherman tanks, and headed for the castle with Gangl and a handful of German troops. Think about this moment. American and German soldiers, days after Hitler's death, riding together to protect prisoners from fanatical Nazis. The strangest alliance of the war, formed not by grand strategy, but by shared recognition of what was right. When they reached Castle Itter on May 4th, Lee assessed the situation with a soldier's eye. The castle could be defended, but his force was small. One Sherman tank, his beloved Besotten Jenny, 14 Americans, 10 Germans under Gangle, and the French prisoners themselves, who refused to hide and instead grabbed weapons from the abandoned armory. The SS attacked at dawn on May 5th. Over 100 troops with anti-aircraft guns and mortars. Lee's tank provided covering fire from the main gate. American and German soldiers fought side by side from the castle walls. The French prisoners, men who'd been captives for years, now defended their own survival with rifles and submachine guns. The battle raged for hours. Ammunition ran low. Lee's tank took direct hits from an 88mm gun and was destroyed. Relief forces from the American 142nd Infantry Regiment were on their way, but would they arrive in time? Major Gangle, the German officer who'd chosen humanity over ideology, died protecting former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud from an SS sniper. In the war's final days, a German soldier gave his life to save a French politician. The complexity of that moment still resonates. Jean Borotra, the tennis star, volunteered for an impossible task. He vaulted the castle wall and ran through SS lines to reach the relief force and guide them back. His athletic skills, honed on tennis courts across Europe, now served to save lives in the war's strangest battle. The relief force arrived just as the defenders' ammunition ran out. The SS troops scattered. Every prisoner survived. Captain Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross. A street in Austria was named for Major Gangle, honoring the German officer who'd sacrificed everything to protect the innocent. This wasn't the only time American forces risked themselves for Germans. These moments happened across occupied Germany in ways large and small. But they were rarely publicized. They didn't fit neat narratives of heroes and villains. They complicated the story Americans wanted to tell about their victory. Yet these complications revealed profound truths about American values under pressure, about what happened when individual soldiers faced moral choices in real time, about whether humanitarian principles would survive contact with justified rage and horror. The transformation of American policy from harsh restriction to humanitarian aid didn't happen overnight. It evolved through 1946 and 47 as the reality of Europe's humanitarian crisis became undeniable. The brutal winter of 1946 to 47, the Hunger Winter, threatened mass starvation across Germany. German civilians were dying, not from Allied action, but from the collapse of German society and infrastructure. Children suffered from malnutrition-related diseases. Elderly Germans froze in unheated homes. The medical system, already strained, buckled under epidemic diseases spreading through displaced populations. American policymakers faced a choice: allow the humanitarian catastrophe to unfold, which would validate the harshest voices calling for German suffering, or intervene with food aid and medical supplies, which would anger Americans who felt Germans deserved whatever happened to them. The decision, when it came, reflected pragmatic concerns as much as humanitarian ones. General Clay's warning about democracy and calories wasn't just compassion. It was recognition that desperate, starving people make poor candidates for the democratic reconstruction America hoped to achieve in Germany. By mid-1946, restrictions began easing. Food shipments increased. The Red Cross gained greater access. Care packages arrived in growing numbers. American civilians, despite knowing what Germany had done, chose to help German families rebuild their lives. This American response stood in stark contrast to other Allied approaches. Soviet treatment of German civilians in their occupation zone was harsh, reflecting the brutal Eastern Front War. French authorities, remembering German occupation of France, showed limited mercy. British policy, strained by their own post-war shortages, offered minimal assistance. American policy evolved towards something different. Not forgiveness exactly. Germans would face justice through the Nuremberg trials and denazification programs. But punishment of leaders didn't require punishing children. Holding individuals accountable didn't mean allowing entire populations to starve. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, represented the culmination of this evolution. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed massive economic aid to rebuild Europe, including Germany. The plan wasn't charity. It served American interests by creating stable, prosperous trading partners and bulwarks against Soviet expansion. But it was also recognition that Europe's recovery required Germany's recovery, that punishing Germany economically, as had been done after World War I, created conditions for extremism and another war. The Marshall Plan chose investment over vengeance, reconstruction over retribution. West Germany received substantial Marshall Plan aid starting in 1949. The aid helped rebuild German industry, modernize infrastructure, and stabilize the economy. The results were dramatic. Within a decade, West Germany transformed from rubble and starvation to the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. This transformation wouldn't have been possible without the humanitarian aid that kept Germans alive in the immediate post-war years. The rations that prevented mass starvation, the medical supplies that controlled epidemics, the housing materials that provided shelter, these formed the foundation on which the Marshall Plan built. But beyond policy and economic aid, the most profound impact came from those individual interactions between American soldiers and German civilians. The young GI who shared his chocolate, the medic who treated German children, the officer who ensured German hospitals had medicine. These Americans, often barely adults themselves, faced impossible moral complexity. They'd seen concentration camps. They'd lost friends in combat against German forces. They had every reason to hate. Yet many chose compassion over hatred. They recognized shared humanity even across the divide of recent enemies. German civilians who experienced this compassion carried those memories for life. They told their children and grandchildren about the American soldier who'd helped when help was least expected. These stories shaped German attitudes toward America and Americans for generations. The contrast with Nazi propaganda couldn't have been sharper. Germans had been told Americans were culturally inferior, motivated only by materialism, incapable of true civilization. What they experienced was young Americans who treated them with basic human decency even after discovering the full horror of Nazi crimes. This cognitive dissonance forced many Germans to confront uncomfortable truths. If Nazi propaganda about Americans was so completely wrong, what else had been lies? The humanity shown by American soldiers became a crack in the edifice of Nazi ideology that helped break its hold on German society. The process of denazification, attempting to remove Nazi influence from German society and government, was complex and imperfect. Many former Nazis escaped justice. Many opportunists claimed they'd never truly believed. The process was frustrating for Americans who wanted thorough accountability, but the humanitarian approach created space for genuine transformation. Germans who received help from former enemies had to reconcile that help with their previous beliefs. Cognitive dissonance drove some toward genuine reckoning with what Germany had done and supported. Not all Germans experienced this transformation. Some remained unrepentant. Some blamed Allied bombing or occupation rather than accepting German responsibility for the war. The process of coming to terms with Nazi crimes took generations and remains incomplete even today. But enough Germans recognized the moral example set by American soldiers and civilians. Enough understood that the compassion they received was unearned and unexpected. That recognition helped lay the groundwork for German democracy and Germany's eventual integration into Western institutions. The children who received chocolate from American soldiers grew up in democratic West Germany. They became the generation that pushed for honest reckoning with Nazi crimes. They built the prosperous, democratic Germany that became America's ally. That trajectory began with small acts of humanity in 1945 and 46. The long-term impact extended beyond Germany. The American approach to occupied Germany, eventually choosing humanitarian aid over harsh punishment, influenced post-war reconstruction elsewhere. It established principles that would shape American foreign policy for decades. The contrast with Soviet treatment of occupied territories highlighted different values and approaches. Where Soviet forces extracted resources and imposed harsh control, American forces eventually invested in reconstruction and promoted democratic institutions. This contrast defined the Cold War divide. West Germany's success became a showcase for Western values and market economics. The transformation from Nazi dictatorship to prosperous democracy demonstrated that former enemies could be rehabilitated through investment and institutional support rather than perpetual punishment. This lesson shaped American approaches to Japan, South Korea, and later to post-communist Eastern Europe. The principle that former enemies could become democratic allies through patient reconstruction and humanitarian aid became a cornerstone of American foreign policy. But the personal stories remain the most powerful testament to what happened in occupied Germany. The German woman who never forgot the American soldier who found medicine for her sick child. The German man who remembered American medics treating his injuries with the same care they gave their own wounded. The German children who grew up remembering kindness from occupying forces. These memories humanized Americans in German eyes. They created personal connections that transcended political relationships. When Germany and America became NATO allies, these personal bonds reinforced official partnership. The generation of Americans who served in occupied Germany also carried memories. They'd faced the full horror of Nazi crimes. They'd seen what hatred and ideology unchecked could produce. Yet many also remembered choosing compassion, helping when they didn't have to, treating former enemies as human beings. These Americans returned home knowing they'd witnessed history's darkest chapter, but also knowing they'd contributed to rebuilding rather than simply destroying, that their service included humanitarian action as well as combat, that they'd helped prevent mass starvation and epidemic disease even among populations that had supported their enemies. The complexity of this experience shaped the generation that built post-war America. They'd seen evil, they'd fought it, they'd won, but they'd also shown mercy and helped rebuild. This complicated moral landscape influenced how they raised their children and built their society. The lessons from occupied Germany remain relevant. They demonstrate that humanitarian principles can survive even justified anger, that individual choices matter, that showing compassion to former enemies doesn't erase their crimes, but can help build better futures. They also show the limits of punishment as policy. Harsh occupation of Germany after World War I contributed to conditions that enabled Nazi rise. Humanitarian reconstruction after World War II contributed to democracy and prosperity. The contrast couldn't be clearer. German civilians who couldn't believe American troops would risk their lives to save them learned profound lessons. They learned that propaganda lies, that enemies can show unexpected humanity, that mercy is possible even after terrible crimes, that rebuilding is possible after destruction. These lessons didn't excuse Nazi crimes. Germans still bore responsibility for what their nation had done. But the American response demonstrated that responsibility didn't require perpetual punishment, that former enemies could eventually reconcile, that better futures were possible. The American soldiers who made these choices, often in defiance of official policy, demonstrated moral courage as important as physical courage in combat. They showed that following conscience sometimes means disobeying orders, that humanitarian values matter even when inconvenient, that seeing the humanity in enemies is strength, not weakness. As we look back across 80 years, the story of American troops risking themselves for German civilians challenges simple narratives. It complicates the clean story of good versus evil. It introduces moral complexity into what we prefer to remember as a clear-cut just war. But this complexity enriches rather than diminishes the story. It shows that even in history's darkest moments, individuals can choose compassion, that systems and policies matter, but so do personal decisions, that the aftermath of war requires different courage than combat itself. The German mother in that Ruhr Valley basement, expecting the worst and receiving unexpected help, represented millions who experienced similar moments. Americans arriving with rations instead of revenge, with medicine instead of retribution, with basic human decency instead of the hatred Nazi propaganda had predicted. These moments didn't erase Nazi crimes. They didn't balance the moral ledger or provide easy reconciliation, but they planted seeds. Seeds of recognition that humanity persists even through horror, that mercy is possible even after discovering the depths of human evil, that rebuilding is an option even after total war. Those seeds grew into German democracy, Atlantic alliance, and eventual European integration. The woman who received help from American soldiers raised children in democratic West Germany. Those children built careers in a prosperous, free society. Their children, the grandchildren of that desperate moment in 1945, grew up in a Germany that was America's ally and partner. That trajectory wasn't inevitable. It required thousands of individual decisions by American soldiers and policymakers to choose humanitarian aid over harsh punishment, to see German civilians as human beings rather than just as enemy nationals, to risk criticism and career consequences to do what conscience demanded. The story of American troops risking their lives to save German civilians is ultimately a story about moral choices under pressure, about what happens when values meet reality, about whether principles survive contact with justified anger and horror. The answer, imperfect and complicated, is that sometimes they do, not always, not consistently, but often enough to matter. Often enough to change the trajectory of history. Often enough that German civilians, expecting the worst, instead encountered unexpected humanity. That humanity, multiplied across thousands of interactions over years of occupation, helped transform Germany from enemy to ally, helped build the post-war order that brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to Europe, helped demonstrate that even after total war, reconciliation remains possible. The American soldiers who shared their rations, who bent regulations to help civilians, who risked themselves to protect former enemies, didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as doing what seemed right in impossible circumstances, following conscience when systems failed, choosing humanity when hatred would have been easier. But their choices mattered. They demonstrated that American values could survive even the test of discovering concentration camps. That mercy was possible even after witnessing industrial murder, that the commitment to human dignity applied even to those who'd supported its opposite. German civilians couldn't believe Americans would help them, but Americans did help. Not perfectly, not universally, not without reluctance and debate, but they helped. And in helping, they planted the seeds of everything that followed. Democracy, prosperity, alliance, partnership, reconciliation. That's the legacy. Not a simple story of heroes saving villains, but a complex story of humans choosing compassion despite every reason not to. of systems eventually aligning with conscience, of policies evolving to match values, of former enemies becoming partners because individuals chose mercy over vengeance, the American soldier offering chocolate to German children, the medic treating German civilians, the officer ensuring hospitals had medicine. These weren't the dramatic heroes of combat. They were the quiet heroes of aftermath, the ones who chose to help when helping was hardest, who showed humanity when humanity seemed impossible, and German civilians, expecting occupation's harshness, instead found unexpected compassion. That surprise, that cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality, between expectation and experience, opened minds and changed hearts. It didn't erase crimes, but it created space for something better to grow. That's what German civilians couldn't believe, not just that Americans would help, but that help was possible after such horror, that humanity could survive such inhumanity, that mercy could follow such evil, that former enemies could eventually reconcile. The proof that it was possible lies in the decades that followed, in German democracy, in Atlantic alliance, in European integration, in former enemies becoming partners. None of that was inevitable. All of it required choosing humanity over hatred, reconstruction over retribution, mercy over vengeance. American troops risking their lives to save German civilians. It happened, not in every case, not perfectly, but often enough to matter, often enough to change history, often enough that we should remember and honor those who made that choice. Because their choice proved that even after the worst humanity can do, better futures remain possible. That reconciliation isn't naive, but courageous. That showing mercy to former enemies isn't weakness, but strength. That the hard work of peace requires different courage than the clarity of war. That's the story German civilians couldn't believe, the story that challenges us still. The story that reminds us that moral complexity persists even in history's clearest conflicts, and that our choices in aftermath matter as much as our actions in combat. The American troops who helped German civilians, who chose compassion over hatred, who risked themselves for former enemies, left a legacy that transcends their individual actions. They demonstrated what America could be at its best. They showed that values survive testing. They proved that humanity persists even through horror. And they changed the world, one act of compassion at a time, one German civilian helped at a time, one moment of unexpected mercy at a time. Until those moments accumulated into something larger, into policy change, into cultural shift, into eventual reconciliation. That's the power of individual moral choice. That's why these stories matter. That's why we should remember the American troops who risked their lives to save German civilians, not to excuse what Germany did, but to honor what America chose, to remember that even in darkness, light persists, that even after evil, good remains possible, that humanity survives, always.